As a boy, I not only wondered at the existence of the cosmos, I also wondered about how it began. I remember lying in bed at night trying to think of a beginningless universe. Every event would be preceded by another event, back and back into the past with no stopping point, or more accurately, no starting point. An infinite past with no beginning. My mind reeled at the prospect. It just seemed inconceivable to me. There must have been a beginning at some point, I thought, in order for everything to get started. Again, little did I realize that for centuries, millennia really, men had grappled with the idea of an infinite past and the question of whether there was an absolute beginning. Ancient Greek philosophers believed that matter was necessary and uncreated and therefore eternal. God may be responsible for introducing order into the cosmos, but he did not create the universe itself. This Greek view was in contrast to the ancient Jewish view about the subject. Hebrew writers held that the universe has not always existed, but was created by God at some point in the past. As the first verse of the Hebrew Holy Scriptures state, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Genesis 1:1. Eventually, these two competing traditions began to interact. There arose in Western philosophy an ongoing debate that lasted for well over 1,000 years as to whether or not the universe had a beginning. This debate played itself out among Jews and Muslims as well as Christians, both Catholic and Protestant. It finally sputtered to something of an inconclusive end in the thought of the great 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. He held, ironically, that there are rationally compelling arguments for both sides, thereby exposing the bankruptcy of reason itself. I first became aware of this debate only after graduating from college. Having become a Christian my junior year in high school, I was soon faced with the decision of picking a college to attend. Sandy, the girl in my German class who first shared with me her faith in Christ, suggested that I apply to Wheaton College, where her older brother Paul was a student. Studying at a Christian college really appealed to me as a young believer, and so I applied and lo and behold was accepted to study at Wheaton. Now, you have to understand that I had never been a part of the Christian subculture before. And so attending Wheaton was for me like a taste of heaven. Professors who prayed before class. There was daily chapel. You never heard swearing or filthy talk in the locker room and so on. It was wonderful. But the truly priceless gift that Wheaton gave to me was the integration of my faith and learning. I saw that as a Christian, I didn't need to stick my brains in one pocket and my faith in the other pocket and never let them both see the light of day at the same time. Rather, I could have a Christian world view, a Christian perspective on science, a Christian perspective on history, a Christian perspective on literature, a Christian perspective on the arts, and so on. And it was at Wheaton that I got the vision of sharing my faith in the context of presenting an intellectual defense of the gospel to appeal to the head as well as to the heart. Unfortunately, Wheaton was surprisingly weak in apologetics. My theology professor, Robert Weber, taught us that there are no good arguments for God's existence and that the traditional proofs had all been refuted. Although I was skeptical about his claim, I more or less bought into what he said on the basis of his say-so. Then, just prior to graduating from Wheaton, I picked up a book by Stuart Hackett called The Resurrection of Theism on a clearance table at the college bookstore. I have to confess that at the time I wasn't even sure what the title meant. Later, during the fall, when I got around to reading the book, I was absolutely stunned by what I read. In contrast to what I had been taught at Wheaton, Hackett, with devastating logic, was defending arguments for God's existence and providing refutations of every conceivable objection to them. The centerpiece of Hackett's case was the argument that had seized me as a boy. It is rationally inconceivable that the series of past events be infinite. There must have been a beginning of the universe, and therefore a transcendent cause which brought it into being. Reading Hackett's book was a shocking, eye-opening experience for me. I had to find out if he was right. During my senior year at Wheaton, a chapel speaker named John Guest had challenged us seniors to take a couple of years out after graduation to share our faith with university students full-time while we were still about the same age. And that made sense to me, so I decided to put off my plans to go to seminary for 2 years and to join the staff of Campus Crusade for Christ. And I was assigned to the staff team at Northern Illinois University. One of the other members of the staff team was a young single woman named Jan Coleman, a graduate of the University of North Dakota. She was vivacious and outgoing and projected confidence, independence, and strength. She was sold out to Christ and committed to evangelism. Not only that, but with her slim figure and waist length, dark brown hair, and big brown eyes, she was really hot. She even told me that she wanted to go to seminary, precisely the place where I was headed. Well, a girl like this was way out of my league, but I couldn't help but be attracted to her. And miracles still happen. For us, I worked with the guys and she worked with the gals. We fell in love, and we were married by the end of that school year. We then set our sights on the master's degree program in philosophy of religion, spearheaded by Dr. Norman Geisler at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School north of Chicago. One of the program's entrance requirements was the graduate record exam in philosophy. So over the next year, in preparation for the exam, I read and took detailed notes on Frederick Copleston's monumental 9-volume history of philosophy. And it was there that I discovered the long history of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian thought about the argument which Hackett was defending. I determined that if I could ever do doctoral work in philosophy, I would write my PhD dissertation on this argument. Well, we spent 2 great years at Trinity, during which time I earned master's degrees in philosophy of religion and in church history. It was a crucial stepping stone in the path that God had set for us. In our life together as a married couple, the Lord has usually shown us only enough light along the path to take the very next step without knowing what lies further along the trail. So one evening, as Jan and I were nearing the end of our time at Trinity, we were sitting at the supper table talking about what to do after graduation, and neither of us had any clear idea or leading about what we should do. So Jan said to me, "Well, if money were no object, what would you really like to do next?" And I replied, "Well, if money were no object, I'd really like to go to England and do a doctorate under John Hick." And she said, "Who's he?" And I said, "Oh, he's this famous British philosopher who's written extensively on arguments for the existence of God. And if I could study with him, I could develop a cosmological argument for God's existence." But it hardly seemed like a realistic idea. Well, the next evening, Jan handed me a slip of paper with John Hick's address on it. She said, "I went to the library today and I found out that he's at the University of Birmingham in England. Why don't you write to him and ask him if you can do a doctoral thesis under him on the cosmological argument?" What a woman. So I did. And to our amazement and delight, Professor Hick wrote back saying he'd be very pleased to supervise my doctoral work on that subject. So it was an open door. The only problem was the University of Birmingham required an official banker's certification that we had all of the money for all of the years required that it would take to complete the doctoral program in philosophy at the University of Birmingham. They didn't want foreign students dropping out midway because they had run out of cash. Well, we didn't have that kind of money. In fact, we were as poor as church mice. Our little efficiency apartment at Trinity was so small that lying on our mattress on the floor, you could reach out and touch the refrigerator. It was all in one little room. In fact, we used to cut paper plates in half in order to cut down on expenses. That led to an embarrassing moment one evening when we had Dr. Geisler over for dessert. And Jan, not even thinking about it, served him his piece of pie on a half a paper plate. Well, gracious to a fault, he never even said a thing, but just ate his dessert. But we really sensed that God was calling us to go to England to do that doctoral degree. There weren't any scholarships for foreign students at that time from financially strapped British universities, so we had to come up with the money ourselves. So every morning and every evening we began to pray that the Lord would supply all of this money to do this doctoral study in Great Britain. Well, to make a long story short, we made an appointment with a non-Christian businessman whose family had supported Jan on Campus Crusade staff, and we laid out for him what we believed God was calling us to do. And this non-Christian businessman gave us, not loaned us, he gave us all of the money for all of the years that we would need to complete the doctoral study under John Hick at the University of Birmingham. It was one of the most astonishing provisions of the Lord that I have ever seen in my life. So Jan and I felt as though God had just miraculously plucked us up and transported us to England to do this degree. I did write on the cosmological argument under Professor Hick's direction, and eventually 3 books flowed out of that doctoral dissertation. I was able to explore the historical roots of Hackett's argument, as well as to deepen and advance his analysis. I also discovered quite amazing connections to contemporary astronomy and astrophysics. Because of its historic roots in medieval Islamic theology, I christened the argument the Kalam cosmological argument. Kalam is the Arabic word for medieval theology. Today, this argument, largely forgotten since the time of Kant, is once again back at center stage. The Cambridge Companion to Atheism of 2007 reports, and I quote, "A count of the articles in philosophy journals shows that more articles have been published about Craig's defense of the Kalam argument than have been published about any other philosopher's contemporary formulation of an argument for God's existence. Theists and atheists alike cannot leave Craig's Kalam argument alone." So we thank the Lord for the privilege of studying this historic argument. And in the following lecture, I want to share it with you. The title of this lecture is "Why Did the Universe Begin?" What is the Kalam cosmological argument? Let's allow one of its greatest medieval champions to speak for himself. Al-Ghazali was a 12th century Muslim theologian from Persia, or modern-day Iran. He was concerned that Muslim philosophers of his day were being influenced by ancient Greek philosophy to deny God's creation of the universe. They held that the universe flows necessarily out of God and is therefore beginningless. After thoroughly studying the teachings of these philosophers, Al-Ghazali wrote a withering critique of their views entitled "The Incoherence of the Philosophers." In this fascinating book, he argues that the idea of a beginningless universe is absurd, the universe must have a beginning, and since nothing begins to exist without a